Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio.
I can remember talking to orders of nuns about the kind of problems that they were having within their community and strife that existed between people who saw the world in very different ways. And I think they were of a mind, well, how can we get together in a way? How can we have an amalgam of these various viewpoints? And my approach to the problem was, look, start out with the fact that you have fundamental differences. You have women in this community who look at the world in very different ways. And because they look at the world differently, their theology is different.
Joining Father Bacik in today's Reflections is Father Jim Troutwine, Episcopal Chaplain at Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio. Today's Reflections focuses on the topic of the progressive and conservative elements in the Church. Here's Father Bacik.
Jim, you and I both are closely associated with the church, ministering within the churches, and therefore I would like to talk a bit with you about the trends that we find in our churches. Some people would say that we see division within the church between progressive or liberal people and, on the other hand, conservative-type thinkers. I think some people would like to identify me with progressive positions, and I've heard you characterized on occasion as a conservative-type thinker. So maybe we could even get into a little dialogue on some of these questions.
Well, I'd be glad to correct anything you want to raise.
Well, that's a good way to start, I guess. One of the things that I notice, even in terminology, we have certain problems. In other words, to call a person a conservative very often seems almost a put-down kind of phrase, at least in some circles. I've moved to the position of often talking about people that are in that camp as being classical-type thinkers. Somehow the word has a better ring to me and actually suggests, I think, more clearly what thinkers in that realm are about. The classical thinker, in my mind, is very much in touch with the tradition, is very interested in the timeless character of truth, wants to sharpen the issues, is often interested in clear-cut definitions of the matters at hand. I think very often the classical thinkers remind us of our need to clean up our language in some way, to make sure the way we are speaking is in touch with what people have said before. I find that classical thinkers very often have a good sense of history and want to make the tradition work for us in some sort of contemporary and current way. On the other hand, I often like to describe the progressive or liberal wing as contemporary in their approach. I follow the terminology there of a thinker by the name of Bernard Lonergan. I suppose that's sort of unimportant in a way, except his analysis has always struck me as being helpful. The contemporary type thinker seems to be more in tune with the modern world, is interested in the question of evolution, sees truth very definitely as being historically and culturally conditioned, often wants to make the Christian message relevant to our own times, is very interested in playing ball with the secular culture in which we live. And therefore, that type of thinking looks very different. You and I, in previous occasions, have talked about the fact that the real divisions within the Christian world today are very often not along the traditional denominational lines between Catholics and Lutherans and Presbyterians and so on, but really relate more to our general viewpoint of the world, whether we are classical or contemporary thinkers, whether we view the world in terms of timeless truths or historically and culturally conditioned truth. And perhaps we can build our discussion around that kind of distinction.
I think that distinction is an important one, and there are one or two things that I think we might want to point out about it. One is that this is a division that doesn't occur just within the Christian community. This is a division among human beings as such. And therefore, it's a division that has to be accepted. The moment you begin to use terminology, whether you use names like conservative or classicist or reactionary, however one uses the term, if the intent of the term is to read the other person out of court, to imply, to a supposed third person or a supposed audience, that this person's viewpoint is simply not worth hearing, then I think you've already cut short any hope of discourse. What we have to do is to accept the fact that there are people of different temperaments, different outlooks, and they will permanently be our neighbors. Therefore, we have to look at them as a light just as good as our own, but shining in a slightly different direction. Therefore, useful to us.
Yeah, I think that is a very important point. I'd like to stay with it for a while and echo it in certain ways. I can remember talking to orders of nuns about the kind of problems that they were having within their community and strife that existed between people who saw the world in very different ways. And I think they were of a mind, well, how can we get together in a way? How can we have an amalgam of these various viewpoints? And my approach to the problem was, look, start out with the fact that you have fundamental differences. You have women in this community who look at the world in very different ways. And because they look at the world differently, their theology is different. And because of that, their general appreciation and approach to Christianity is different. And therefore, you will have different lifestyles growing out of that. And even gets up to the question of how they would end up dressing in more contemporary ways or more traditional ways. My point to them was that this is a fact. It exists in this way. There's no way to get around it. You cannot have an amalgam. You can't produce some sort of third thing by putting these two groups together. They stand there as totally different approaches. And the only solution to the problem, I won't say the only one, but one solution to the problem is to remember that the two groups have to live in charity. They start out with the conviction that the other group is there to stay. As you well pointed out, we don't want to read them out of the order. They're part of this community, and so we must learn to get along. We have to have tolerance for one another. We could learn from one another. We have to exist in charity. We can go to communion together and so on. Now, I use the example of the nuns to illustrate your major point, but it also can be said about any congregation, any particular parish. Within that parish, you are going to have people who can be classified as contemporary type people and others who are classicists in their outlook. And I think the same point has to be made to them. Look, we can't read either of the other groups out of the community. We have to learn to live together. And we come to the Lord's Supper together. We say the Lord's Prayer together. We have to live out the law of love together. And so there are things that bind us together. I think more can be said than that, but that's a starting point.
Well, you remember Michael Novak, who is a very sensitive Christian. He's a layman. He's a person who's widely read, widely listened to. And in talking not about the religious, but the political community, he took issue with the fact that America is frequently referred to as the Great Melting Pot. He said he really didn't like that idea. He saw no reason that everything that enters into the American scene should be reduced to some kind of a common blah taste, like a sort of a cosmic hash. That he would prefer to think of America not as a melting pot, but rather as a good salad, within which each of the component parts, a little fruit chopped up, a carrot here and there, a bit of cheese, some hard-boiled egg, a bit of lettuce, a leaf or two of spinach, each would retain its own distinctive flavor and its own recognizable identity, and still would contribute to the whole thing. Now, I think that image that he used for the secular world, for the political, social world of the United States, might be valuable for people in the church. I think we've got to find a way in which people of differing temperament and viewpoint can be recognized as brothers, can be recognized as worth everything in the life of the church and desirable, and still can be recognized as having a viewpoint with which I perhaps do not agree.
I wonder if that melting pot notion hasn't ended up influencing us in the church, in the United States especially, and suggested to us somehow that we needed uniformity, or that everyone had to think the same way. I think there are other sources of that, but it might just have been intensified by the notion that in the United States, because of the melting pot, we're all supposed to be the same. We're all Americans, therefore maybe all Presbyterians should think the same, or all Catholics should think the same. Although I believe there are other roots of that, especially in the Catholic world that I'm familiar with. There were other reasons why we expected uniformity. There was the notion that the church was monolithic, that everyone thought the same. Most Catholics had no perception that there had been fights throughout the years that in the Christian community, that there were different schools of thought, that people had disagreed. Do you remember what a shock it was when the bishops gathered at the Second Vatican Council, to both Protestants and Catholics, that they disagreed on questions, that the newspapers started reporting that there was a progressive wing of bishops and more conservative bishops, and they were arguing out points, and they disagreed, and they were trying to reach consensus and all of that. It was a shock, so that I think that people in our Catholic world, at least, were sort of before that programmed to think that all Catholics were the same, or were expected to be the same. So maybe we have at least a couple of roots of this failure to appreciate pluralism. But I think you're going back to the cultural situation in the United States is vital. As we often say, you can't talk about the church in isolation. The people who make up the church in the United States are also citizens of this country. We are influenced by the fact that we are born in this country, raised, we have this particular political system, and so on. And I think that a lot of the literature I see today really knocks that melting pot idea. Andrew Greeley is another one. He has another image, not quite as graphic as yours, I guess, but his is that we don't have a melting pot, but a mosaic that forms our country. And he says it's a mosaic with permeable boundaries. That is, that there's movement between the parts of the mosaic. And so that Catholics in the United States end up being influenced by Protestants and vice versa. So perhaps we're getting a lot of literature that suggests that we need to retain our individuality, to get back to our roots. That's the rise of ethnicity. One of Novak's books is entitled The Unmeltable Ethnics. Those who won't melt into the pot, who want to maintain their traditions and their identity. And I think that's a healthy movement, and
well,
a lot of people are interested in it.
I think we might go to another popular writer. Do you remember the late Douglas Welsh, who was a columnist? He passed away some years ago, but his writing had a certain pointed quality about it. It was humorous, but it was also profound. He used to dislike what he called six-pack thinking. The idea that if you buy a particular concept, a particular point, a particular program, then you are automatically grouped with a certain number of people who buy that program, and you must be prepared to support with them 5 other programs to which they are given, even though you may not like the other 5. And he said that he didn't like six-pack thinking. He wanted a situation in which, if he wanted to, he could buy just the one bottle and take that and let the other go. I'm inclined to think that in the church, as well as in the secular world, we're given to six-pack thinking. We have the idea that if you are supporting me on a given issue, then you can't argue with me on some other issues that may be dear to my heart and pretty cold as far as you're concerned. I think we have to turn away from that and accept again a willingness to deal with particular issues on their own merits, and to deal with people apart from the issues.
Yeah, so we don't end up stereotyping people too quickly and
or
placing
turning
them
away
into
from them.
Categories and saying, well, they always think like this,
Yes.
or those people obviously can't be dealt with because they're not interested or don't think like I do. I remember Karl Rahner making the suggestion that the various groupings within a parish ought to at times invite people from the other wing or the people who have a different piety into their grouping.
Yes.
And why couldn't they, to listen to them? Why couldn't that be part of the normal exchange that goes on within a parish? And as I'm talking about our Christian world today, we've been talking about progressives and conservatives, and we certainly must make room for the modern charismatic movement in all of this as a really distinct group, I think, that is to be found within most of the mainline churches.
Yes, and among the charismatics you will find a certain number of people, not all charismatic, but largely identified with it, who are more prone to accept a fundamentalist conception of Scripture and authority, something that's been theologically out of fashion for a long while, which other people tend to sort of dismiss with a laugh. Well, it can be a useful tool by which religion is understood and lived, and I'm not sure that we should be quite so quick simply to dismiss it because it is not a tool useful to us.
No, one of the reasons I think we do dismiss that kind of thing is because we are not confident of our own outlook. It seems to me what opens us up to real dialogue is when I feel rather sure of myself. Not that I got all the answers, but that whatever I have arrived at is worthwhile, that my stance is okay. I mean, I've talked to a lot of people who tell me that when they dialogue with charismatics, they end up getting turned off because they feel inadequate, because they feel that the charismatic or evangelical person is holier, or speaks more about God, or is more enthusiastic about the whole thing, and therefore they feel inferior. They feel like they don't measure up, and therefore they can't enter into dialogue. I think one of the solutions to really getting along with each other in the church is that we feel that our position is okay, that there's something worthwhile about it, the sense that it's working for me all right. Therefore, I don't have to try to convert you to my position right away. I don't have to try to make you think like me. And I don't have to jump on you and, batter you down in some way. I can be more relaxed then and allow you to have your voice and drink in whatever wisdom you have. So I'm suggesting that one of the tools for dialogue, it seems to me, is self-confidence. When we feel good about our own knowledge of things, our own perception of things, and again, not in an exclusive sense, but a sense that would open me then to the truth and goodness wherever I would find it in the other groupings.
That would mean, then, that people who lead our communities, whether they are political leaders or academic leaders or religious leaders, have got to be a little more open than perhaps most people. If they're in a position of leadership, they've got to be prepared to see, utilize, bring into the general experience of the community people who may represent schools they themselves do not particularly care for.
I mean, it's absolutely true. It's probably one of the reasons why leadership within a parish is so difficult these days, why people find it hard to be pastors or the leaders of the community, because it is such a challenging thing. And to listen to all the elements, to try to make everyone feel at home and comfortable, to keep harmony going between various groupings. I think that really is a challenge to the leadership today. It would have to be made concrete. Let's talk a bit about how a leader would do that, or what would a parish look like that really functioned this way. I think one thing that we tried to do at St. Thomas More in Bowling Green was to have a charismatic mass each week, where we tried to bring in the evangelical types and the charismatic types and allow them to worship in their own way, provide a setting for that. I know I had the opportunity to celebrate the Mass for them one time. I found it a really important experience to me. I mean, I tried to go with their piety. While it is not my own piety, not my normal way of expressing my Christianity, I made a real effort to do it their way, to allow longer periods of prayer, to build in a lot of spontaneous prayer throughout the Mass, to preach the sermon in a very biblically oriented way, and all of that. But I felt it was an enriching experience to me. I won't say I didn't go into it without some trepidation or anxiety, but it was valuable to me to do. Well, I'm just saying that's one little way that in our parish we tried to open ourselves up to this. I think of the more traditional parishes where conservative ways sort of are the ordinary way of doing things, that they need, for example, to have maybe a folk mass. They have at least one of the masses on Sunday that would cater to the young people, where there would be guitars, where there would be the opportunity for more spontaneity in the liturgy and so on. That would be another way that parishes, it seems to me, could try to do this.
I think this is a good model. It's the kind of thing we're going to have to look for more practice of this kind of thing, because I think one of the difficulties we're running into, and again, I don't see it just within the church, I see it as a problem within the community at large, is a tendency to polarize, a tendency to say, well, that group simply has nothing to contribute. And I think that Christian people, if we're going to be the reconcilers we are supposed to be, then we're going to have to learn to reach out and do this and perhaps provide some kind of model for the world around us. Now, that means we have to practice what we preach, and that's always very difficult to do.
Right. The church needs to be this sign, doesn't it? Because the secular world is not finding good ways of doing it. Not that we in the church are yet either, but it sort of highlights our task. The modern world needs this. We have to learn to live in a pluralistic world with tolerance and respect. We have to learn to dialogue. And I don't think in our secular society as a whole we have learned to do that very well.
Well, we talked on another occasion about the ecumenical picture in the world today in Christendom. Now, what you have seen there is something that is actually quite unusual in terms of ordinary human history. You have great societies which have split apart from each other and have been engaged in opposition to each other. And now suddenly they have turned around completely and are approaching each other, courting each other, working with each other. I don't know whether we can carry that off, and of course we went through that discussion on another occasion. If we can carry it off, if it's possible to carry this through, it would be a model unique in the history of mankind. It would be a model which would be, no doubt, very impressive in the minds of thinking people around the world. It would also be a very useful thing for ordinary men and women to see how, practically, large communities function together, having within themselves great blocks of people who do think differently, react differently, whose ethnic background, whose culture, whose temperament is all varied. And if within that there could be a practical demonstration of mutual trust, a practical carrying on of day-by-day life in which people really did reach out to, touch with, work with other people of such varied backgrounds, I think there's no question that the effect of that on the world around us would be very impressive.
I think so, definitely. I was thinking about another approach to this. We've been emphasizing the diversity and the fact that the groups are apart and that they can't be melded together very easily, although we're calling upon them to live in harmony. But when we get down to the primary human experiences in life is when we seem to draw closer together. You ever notice when people are fighting in a family and there's a death in the family, then suddenly it all looks different. In the light of this terrible tragedy, people begin to come together. They have to grapple with this question of death. And that is a part of our common human experience. It seems to me when we begin talking to one another about the deepest issues, about our struggle for meaning in life, for our attempt to find something that's worthwhile, to get over the anxieties that threaten us, then we begin to speak in a more common way. All of us are born and die and have to suffer grief and try to work out our relationships and deal with our problems in life and struggle with the mystery that surrounds us. That is common to all of us. Now, when we begin to talk like that, it seems we come closer together. And maybe we begin to find a common language, and it seems to overcome some of this difference that we have in the way we perceive our world.
So that in effect you're repeating something from one of the Gospels where Jesus says to his disciples, "Woe to you, you're in trouble, when all men speak well of you." When everything is going well, that's when the difficulties arise. I'm quite sure that's true. Mm-hmm. But of course, what does that say about our ordinary community life, our normal day-by-day life? We don't really need to draw on our reserves of love, of careful, planned, deliberate charity when everything is in crisis, because at those moments we are drawn together. But the problem is that we don't live in those moments of crisis all the time. For the most
we could
part,
think of sharing joys too. I don't know if it would be limited just to negative experiences, but even the great joy at the birth of a child, or
a marriage,
the joy at the time of the wedding, and so on. Here's something where families who feel very different can come together and celebrate that moment. So maybe there are the positive experiences too that are deep in the heart that could draw us together. And it seems like if we could celebrate those in common and maybe talk more about them and reflect on those type of experiences, we would see some commonness that maybe exists down beneath all of the different ways we look at our world. So, of course, as soon as we start talking to them about them in any length or depth, we are going to start to speak about them differently. There's no doubt about that. I don't think we're going to get away from our previous point.
Right.
But we come back always to there's something that binds us together. You and I are human beings. I started out by saying, that you were more conservative and I was more progressive. I don't know if we've proved that yet or not here. We find an awful lot of common ground in our own discussion. We've got to find a way in which maybe we differ and see what we can do with that.
Well, I'm afraid I can't suggest anything. You go ahead. As I say, I'm glad to correct any issue you raise.
So far you're with me in saying that we look at this divergence in our society and in the church, and we have to accept it as a fact, but we move down to a lower level of the common celebrations of birth and death and the great moments of life, and we find a lot of commonness in that.
Certainly we do. And I think that those are the things that have to be emphasized and worked on, but it does require continual practice. This is not something you can achieve and then settle back and rest with. This comes to the ordinary day-by-day practice of Christian disciplines. A willingness to go out and work to attain a Christian scale of behavior with oneself and with other people. Now, I don't know if that's a conservative statement or not, but I'll offer it.
Okay. One of the ways in which I think that we see sort of a new conservatism at work in the church today, a lot of examples of that. There seems to be a certain retrenchment, people wanting to get back to the eternal verities, a certain biblical fundamentalism that has arisen. Certain people would say that there is repression in the churches, a desire to impose uniformity again. Some people will talk about the fact that theologians have been silenced and so on. So I think that a lot of people I talk to have a feeling as though there is sort of almost a reactionary movement going on. One of my senses is that that would have to be fought, that we couldn't allow that to sort of stifle the whole progressive movement that we've seen happening in the last few decades in the churches.
Well,
Does
we
that
have
sound
to be,
too liberal to you when I speak like that?
we have to be careful that we don't reach the point of something I heard not too long ago, in which a young woman of my acquaintance was talking about the growth of fundamentalism on the campuses. And she pointed out that there were a number of fundamentalist, literalist groups rising up, and she wanted to stop that. She didn't feel the mainline liberal traditions should permit this to happen. Now, I think that's an internal contradiction.
I would think so, too. It would seem that, again, each group is going to have to be open to the other group and allow them their space in this one community that we call our church.
You've been listening to Reflections with your host, theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio.